This is the Solid Signal podcast for the week of August 22nd, 2016, and right off the bat, there's a couple of things that I really want to say. First of all, I have a feeling this is going to be one of those longer podcasts because when I wrote my notes for it, I could see that I had an awful lot to say, then I was going to go in a lot of different directions, and honestly, that tends to mean a little bit longer podcast. The second thing is that for the third week in a row, I am somehow managing to avoid my responsibility to plug Solid Signal products, and instead I'm going to go off on a rant which has a lot more personal meaning to me and a lot less personal meaning to, for example, the marketing department of Solid Signal, who would probably prefer that I were pushing products. Well, folks, sometimes you have to be entertaining, and on the other hand, I also kind of use this podcast as a way to clear my mind so that I can focus on doing marketing tasks a little bit more efficiently for the week. Okay, so there's the disclaimer, and you've probably gotten tired of that already. The title of this week's podcast is going to be something like The End of Geek Culture, and I'm going to tell you why. You see, I was thinking last night, in the middle of the night, that this has been one of the most disappointing summers for movies in a very, very long time. There just hasn't been that big runaway hit, that unexpected success. Nothing has really worked for me, and I started doing some research this morning to try to find out if it was, just me, and it turns out no. In fact, a lot of movies have failed to make their initial investment so far, hoping that they'll do better on video. And a lot of movies have just been incredible disappointments in the box office. For example, there was a remake of Ben-Hur, which I really wasn't terribly interested in. I mean, the original was pretty darn good. Don't see why we needed to remake it. And it was a total flop at the box office over the weekend, bringing in about 11 million, and the movie cost about 20 times that to make. Even one of my personal favorite movies of the year, Star Trek Beyond, is considered so far an underperformer, if not an out-and-out flop. That's a shame because it's one of the better Star Trek films, and certainly better than the one that came before it, which was one of the worst. And it kind of makes you wonder, well, why are all these movies flopping? And I came up with two reasons. First of all, there's a certain amount of, every movie tends to look basically identical. There's only so many different ways you can have big bad guys beating each other up in a city and try to make it not look like the original Transformers movie, which was kind of, a big change in the way that movies looked. And that's partially why Batman vs. Superman didn't do well, and it's partially why Star Trek Into Darkness, not the current one, but the one before it, didn't do well. It's just you got these very generic looking fights in the city, and you walk away feeling like you've seen that before. It's not exciting to you. So that's part of it. Part of it is that franchise fatigue that just says, oh my gosh, well, we've already seen this and we've already seen that. But I think the big problem is, honestly, a promotional one. I don't think that the movies this year are really any better or worse than they've been in past years. It's not to say they're good, but they're not really any better or worse. I think the problem actually is that we're seeing an end to the dominance of geek culture. And I want to step back for a minute and explain what I mean by geek and geek culture, because I don't want to offend anybody. A geek, as I'm defining that person here, is the kind of person who immerses themselves in the minutiae of a pop culture phenomenon, whether that's comic books or Star Wars or any of those sort of things. And you could probably be, a fashion geek too, but really the term is usually used for things that are science fiction or fantasy related. And so I'm going to kind of continue with that thought. And geek culture has been a really dominant driver in the last 10 years, as you see shows like Comic-Con really become real, just touchstones for the entire movie making community. And so you see that there's a lot of importance placed on that. And it's made it a really great time to be a geek. As a geek myself, I have to say it's been fantastic to feel like the kind of things that I'm interested in are elevated to a level with others that I also feel I am at. But I'm beginning to suspect that the reign of the geek is already over. and that the dominance that you see in these people who really embrace comic books and science fiction franchises has already faded, and that the reason that we have a bad movie season this year is that studios don't realize it. Studios seem to want to rely on geeks and the blogs and websites that they tend to frequent as sort of self-generating marketing content creation machines. And that's a big term, I understand, but what I'm trying to say is that, you know, 10 years ago, if you wanted to promote a tentpole summer movie, one of those big movies that everybody wanted to see, you'd have billboards and you'd have t-shirts and you'd have massive promotions and TV spots, and it was really the late 1980s version of Batman that pioneered modern marketing for summer blockbusters in a way that nothing else really had. And certainly Star Wars before it, a generation before that, had also been a pioneering force in how this sort of thing was marketed. So, studios realize that most of us are too smart for that kind of marketing blitz now, having gone through it for an entire generation. But instead of coming up with something new, they just got lazy. They let bloggers and reviewers and websites and Comic-Con do the work for them. They let social media spread word of mouth, and that would have worked great, except for it did kind of backfire on them. You found that movies like Batman vs. Superman and Suicide Squad were just slammed in social media. The people just couldn't stop talking about how bad these movies were, and as a result, they underperformed. Suicide Squad seems to be doing pretty well, but it still may not make all the money that it actually cost to make. It may not make its money back, and that's because there was no efficient promotional machine. Take a look at Star Trek. Star Trek was barely promoted outside of social media, and I think that's the reason that it didn't perform in the box office. And it's a shame. Now, box office tickets, theater tickets get more and more expensive every year. Streaming gets more and more convenient every year, and I think that's a big part of it. So you'll see some of the bounce in streaming, but when it comes to summer theater tickets, it's been awful. A little pause here to point out this is probably going to be the longest podcast I've ever done for Solid Signal, so I thank you all for listening, and I promise I won't let it get much longer. I do have just tons to say, and I feel really strongly about it, but I should continue on with my real job. Anyway, so what do? First of all, we don't know what's coming after geek culture fades. It's all probably already faded. But marketing departments need to find that out, and they need to take advantage of that. I'm sad to see that kind of thing go, but I mean, it's been a great 10 years, and so I guess everything has to end at some point. But also, just there has to be a combination of better service at movie theaters. Some have upgraded, some have not, but a lot of movie theaters are just, stinky, smelly, sticky popcorn factories and not much else. And they want to charge you $15 a ticket for an experience that's not as good as what you get at home. And also, I think that we have to start thinking that if we're going to get past this geeky, culture-y phase, maybe we need to start coming up with movies that cost less to make in the first place. It is patently ridiculous to have a movie cost $750 million to make. I'm sorry. I understand a lot of that movie money goes into people's pockets. It's not just stockholders and whatever that benefit from it, but I mean, real people are getting employed to actually make movies. So it's supporting the economy. It's not that. It's just, gosh, you could spend $1 billion a lot better and a lot more efficiently. You could make the world a better place. And when you think about all the money that's spent on all the summer movies in 3 months, I mean, gosh, it's got to be 30 or 40 billion dollars. I mean, there are countries that don't have 30 or 40 billion dollars in income or expenses in the course of a year. And it doesn't necessarily mean the movies are any better. They need to spend more time focusing on smaller movies with smaller budgets and better stories and more engaging and more interesting, and not just the same cities being blown up over and over again. And as a geek myself, I'm ready for that. There's plenty of comic book stories I wish they could still tell, but I'm ready to see movie theaters do a better job telling other stories.